Rant time. I could have done a whole Jimmy Rants on this, but I've done 2 or 3 other Jimmy Rants last year, all about some of the preliminary data about the 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, and we were waiting all year long for them to approve what the final version is. Well, that approval just happened at the very end of December last year, and I'm reading from a press release from the Nutrition Coalition. This is Nina Teicholz's group, because they do a great job of kind of summarizing some of the main points. And we've talked about a lot of these things before. Newsflash, nothing much changed. Which should make you scratch your head. Why didn't much change? Especially in the year of a pandemic where we're seeing the ramifications of comorbidities impacting this virus that's out there. You would think that would have been motivation. Oh, we probably need to stop playing games with these people and start actually giving them usable information. But the headline of the press release from Nutrition Coalition, 2020 to 2025, so these are the guidelines that will be in effect for the next 5 years. Dietary guidelines not applicable for the majority of Americans. Why? Because it didn't scope for 60% of the U.S. who has at least one diet-related chronic disease. The guidelines, and we talked about this in my previous Jimmy Rants, the dietary guidelines excluded all studies looking at weight loss. How many people go on the dietary guidelines because their doctor tells them to, because you need to lose weight? I think a lot of people have. Not us, because we know better now, but when doctors promote nutrition for their patients to be able to lose weight, what do they cite? The Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Well, guess what? The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee did not include any such data from weight loss studies. They also did not reflect any of the latest science over the past decade looking at saturated fat and how healthy it is, especially in the absence of carbohydrate. And there were also significant conflicts of interest on the expert committee that were not disclosed. I talked about this one before. There is a group that is a front group, a scientific medical front group for Coca-Cola. And over half of the members of the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee were on that group, that medical front group for Coca-Cola. So why are we surprised? I'm not. Unfortunately, most people say, well, the Dietary Guidelines had highly respected group of experts, all vetted out the latest science. But did they? No. Nutrition recommendations that are taught to all Americans should necessarily reflect all Americans, and these dietary guidelines clearly fail to do that. The policy is scoped for disease prevention only. Did you know that the Dietary Guidelines was only scoped for disease prevention, not to treat said disease? And what I want to know is, okay, if you're only going to look at preventative nutrition, then by golly, any doctor pushing this for weight loss, anybody pushing the dietary guidelines for anything but preventing disease, they're assuming you're healthy. And we know from previous studies that about 88% of the population has some level of metabolic disease, namely insulin resistance. And so if they have insulin resistance, the vast majority of the population, don't we want to create guidelines that would offer up some kind of help in dealing with that? You would think, but that's not what happened here. They didn't look at any of that science. They only looked at all the preventative measures for the diet. So the expert committee did not review any of the body of science on how to successfully treat any disease with nutrition. Not even studies about weight loss, because I know most people hear dietary guidelines from their doctor. They push it. Oh, you need to lose weight. Go do what the dietary guidelines say. They're vetted out by the science. They didn't look at weight loss studies. If they had, you guys, they would have seen great efficacy with carbohydrate restriction. But they didn't. They left that out. For the U.S. Department of Agriculture to develop a policy so narrowly focused on a small minority of Americans makes little sense, especially since these guidelines are applied to sick and well people alike. And Nutrition Coalition is right. They push this on everybody. To which the question becomes, okay, if they're only for prevention, what's the diet for treatment? The USDA is washing their hands of that one. Nope, we're not involved in the treatment of disease. We're only involved in the prevention, and our diet supposedly will do that. Now, it probably will work well for prevention, because the people that would be prevented and not already have some kind of progression of disease will be very insulin sensitive and can probably handle that diet from the dietary guidelines. But the rest of us, are we SOL? Are we supposed to figure it out on our own? They're not doing a service to Americans, and most Americans don't know it doesn't apply to them. These guidelines can be of little to no use for tens of millions of Americans who are diagnosed with chronic diet-related diseases. So for the past 40 years, the dietary guidelines have become more than just recommendations. They are the single most powerful lever influencing how America eats. A broadly influential policy is considered the gold standard, followed by most healthcare practitioners. Literally go to any doctor. Literally go to any dietitian. They're all going to promote the gospel of the dietary guidelines for Americans. Hasn't served us well. It's also followed by K through 12 educators. So if your kids go to public school, those meals they are served at breakfast and lunch, they're all predicated on the dietary guidelines. Media outlets are in bed with this as well, and the military. I've had many military wives write to me and go, what do I buy at the commissary? It's only foods that are based on the dietary guidelines. It's disgusting, you guys. The dietary guidelines also drive food choices for the $100 billion spent by the USDA on nutrition assistance programs, school lunches, feeding assistance for the elderly and women with infant and children, food for disadvantaged communities, and more. So not only is it impacting all the things above, it's directly impacting so many people that have no choice in the situation. And I've even heard moms talk about how the kids get all the things from the dietary guidelines on the plate, and that they have to put a piece of whole grain bread on there. They have to put, this, they have to put that. They have to keep saturated fat at a certain level. It's just horrible what they are doing, all under the guise of these are fully vetted out, gold standard nutritional advice, right? The populations in these USDA programs have significantly higher rates of diet-related conditions, and yet the foods delivered to them are arguably inappropriate for these diseases. Think about the poorest of the poor. And people wonder, how do poor people get so sick? Poor people get sick because they make poor quality food choices, because that's literally all that's available to them. And then on top of that, when they go to get assistance, that assistance comes in the form of the same old crappy garbage they're buying for themselves. There is evidence to show that the guidelines advise to eat 6 servings of grain a day, 3 of them refined, and up to 10% of calories as sugar will do harm to somebody who has type 2 diabetes. The USDA should at least try to do no harm. So let's take a look at what they did. The science on saturated fat was ignored. That's a big thing they did. Among the science that was excluded by the Dietary Guidelines 2020 version was the last decade of studies on saturated fat. These have, on the whole, concluded that these fats have no effect on heart disease mortality. A group of leading U.S. scientists, including former chairs of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, wrote letters to the secretaries of the USDA and HHS, as well as 56 members of Congress, and they were trying to discuss how the science has evolved, but they were completely ignored. There was also a lack of transparency on the financial conflicts of interest. So, so the current Dietary Guidelines Committee, Advisory Committee, here's some of the conflicts of interest that they did not disclose. Jamie Ard is the current medical director for Nestle's OptiFast weight loss program. Steve Heimsfield is the former global director of scientific affairs at the pharmaceutical company Merck. Richard Mattis is a former member of the scientific advisory board for ConAgra. Barbara Schneeman, I'll say her name right here in a minute. She was the chair of this Dietary Guidelines Committee. She's the president of the Dannon Institute, funded by Dannon, the yogurt company. And then Barbara, again, she's also a member, advisory board member of Monsanto. None of that was disclosed. Is that concerning that there are industry ties? So let's see. See if there's anything else in here. They excluded all clinical trials on weight loss. That's the big concern. The exclusion of the last decade of science on saturated fats, which shows there's little to no effect on cardiovascular health or total mortality. The exclusion of all science looking at low carbohydrate diets. There were more than 65 clinical trials that were offered, and they ignored them all. The continued use of an unverified and unrecognized methodology of looking at science. The rejection of the majority of recommendations made by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to improve transparency. There was a $1 million price tag on that group, and they just ignored everything about it. And then the lack of a requirement for disclosure of their conflicts of interest, which we just talked about. So this is where we are, you guys. We have all of these dietary guidelines. Pretty much same old, same old. And in that same old, you guys, people keep going to continue to get sick. They're going to continue to get worse in their health, not better. How do they allow this to continue on? Like I've told you very famously, I went before the Dietary Guidelines Committee in 2010, just as a layperson. I'd been blogging for a few years, and I decided to go testify. And I testified, and these people could not have been more bored. These people were just disinterested. It was almost as if it was a foregone conclusion what they were going to decide the dietary guidelines were going to be, and science be damned. But I just hate it that the general public thinks that these things are highly vetted out, rigorously, scientifically vetted out, and they're not. They're not. And as you could see, they're not even looking at the latest science. To which I say, how do you fix this problem? I know Nina Teicholz at the Nutrition Coalition has been working on this for a little while. How do you fix this problem? Because as much as her efforts have been wonderful, and there was a lot of pressure put on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee last year, the end result was the same. And so if we're going to have the same guidelines, why will we be surprised when type 2 diabetes and heart disease and obesity and all the rest just don't get better? Why wouldn't they look at people with current disease? Because COVID, if it's not shown us anything else, has shown us that we have a huge metabolic health problem that's directly tied to our nutrition. And if the nutrition gods from on high, the USDA, are telling us this is the way you should eat, and in that way of eating directly impacts your health and developing chronic disease, this should be a concern of every American. So I don't know how it's going to change, guys, other than trying to get people to not pay attention. Because people say, well, nobody pays attention to the guidelines. Oh, you want to bet? Like, it sets policy for so many things. Doctors recommending, dietitians recommending a diet for you to lose weight, for you to be healthy. the public schools, the military commissaries, the people that are disadvantaged on welfare,